joining us for this Purple Heart ceremony this morning. It is my pleasure to introduce the first Coast Guard District Commander, Admiral Neptune, who will be giving the award. So without further ado, Admiral.
Thank you, Angie. Good morning, everyone. Didn't know if we were going to have rain or fog or sunshine today, and this turned out really, really well. So thank you for the family members and the friends of the family that are here today to honor a veteran who was forgotten, if you will, in the process of presenting a Purple Heart 67 years ago. And it was really the work of Dr. Sparky Nersasian, Robert's daughter, who really got this going. And it's fascinating to see stories like this, and I'm excited to be part of it. It's the first time I've been able to present a Purple Heart in all the different ceremonies I've done. This is a first, and I'll remember it for the rest of my life. So we want to honor Nelson for his service to our country, and even though it was 67 years ago, this is an important day, and it's just absolutely the right thing to do. A little bit about the Purple Heart, where it came from, and then maybe a little bit of an explanation, possibly, why it took so long for this to be presented. And then, if you're up for one of the survivors' stories, I've got a fascinating short clip from one of the survivors from the USS Leopold who told his story. It was a crew of 13 officers, 186 enlisted members, and there were just very few survivors. And that's what happens sometimes during war. So just a little bit about the Purple Heart Medal. It goes back to George Washington and the Revolutionary War. Back then, it was put together for crew members who were wounded during war by instruments of war. It's an interesting definition, but people wounded by instruments of war in the hands of the enemy, to survivors, and also posthumously to the family members of the people lost during the war. It goes back to 1782, and George Washington used that as a special award for unusual gallantry and extraordinary fidelity and essential service. USS Leopold was a destroyer escort like so many ships during World War II. They were manned by Coast Guard crews working in Navy battle groups. A lot of the public didn't know that. The Coast Guard grew from 20,000 to 250,000 at the start of World War II. And 1943 is when the USS Leopold was commissioned. It was named after one of the Navy crew members who was lost on the USS Arizona on December 7th, 1941. And I'll leave you with my historical paperwork, so you may have that, but you may not. That tells a little bit about the USS Leopold. That name has only been used once for a naval ship. But the Leopold, when it was commissioned in 43, its first deployment was into the Mediterranean Sea. Destroyer escorts served as a cordon around a convoy of precious cargo that needed to get to the war effort in Europe. And that was one of Leopold's missions, to sort of be at the outside of this valuable cargo heading across the Atlantic. They were screening vessels to look for submarines and other combatants. And on the night of the 8th of March, 1944, Leopold picked up a direction-finding signal. They could hear one of the submarines talking to its command and control, so they did a direction find to it. It was about 7 miles away from the convoy, and they reported that, and they were told to attack and fire at will. It's nighttime, and the group of ships went to the north to try to avoid the submarine, but the submarine followed, and it was actually on the evening of the night that they engaged. And that's when the Leopold was struck by a new kind of torpedo that had an acoustic tracking device, something that was new for the German Navy to use. It hadn't been tested all that much, but it worked, unfortunately, in the case of the Leopold. But she wasn't by herself. The USS Joyce, another destroyer escort, was part of that cordon of destroyer escorts. And the Joyce took attack after the Leopold was hit by the torpedo. It must have struck in a very vulnerable place for the ship because it really didn't take all that long for the ship to founder and find itself laid over on its side. Hence, very few people were able to escape. The 13 officers, and let me check the numbers here, I don't want to get this wrong.
I think that's correct.
It was 13 officers and 158 of the crew members. I can't find that page right now, but it's what happens when I improvise. But a total of 171 crew members of the Leopold were lost by that torpedo attack from the Nazi submarine. The submarine, they gave pursuit. It actually made it back into France to fight another day. The USS Joyce, after they gave up on pursuit, came back because they knew there were survivors in the water. And I'll cover one of the stories of a survivor. One of the chiefs, who was actually the senior-most member, rescued on the Leopold, just so you can get a sense of what happened that night and what they went through, and maybe help understand why so few people survived that torpedoing of the USS Leopold. I got ahead of myself. I just want to talk about the deployment in March of 1944. Departing New York on the 1st of March 1944 on her second voyage, Leopold took her screening station with the 27-ship convoy bound for the British Isles. I had mentioned that the first deployment was into the Mediterranean. This one was headed for England. On the 8th, she reported an HFDF intercept, which indicated an enemy submarine on the route of the convoy. The route was consequently altered. On the 9th of March, while south of Iceland, she reported a radar contact at 7:50 in the evening, about 8,000 yards south of the convoy. Assisted by the destroyer escort Joyce, Leopold was ordered to intercept. General quarters was sounded and orders were issued to fire on sight. A flare was released and gun crews strained to sight the submarine in the lighted area. The U-boat was almost submerged when spotted, and the gun crews had to work blind. Leopold was struck by an acoustic torpedo fired from the German submarine U-255. Badly damaged, she was abandoned. Joyce rescued 28 survivors at the close of the action. 171 others were lost through explosion on board or drowning after abandoning. Leopold remained afloat until early the next morning, then sank just south of Iceland. And what I'd like to do is give you a first-hand account from a chief commissary steward. His name was Cleveland Parker. We hadn't fired more than a few rounds when another sub, laying in wait off our port quarter, threw a torpedo at us. Troy Gower, senior first class, was at his gun station when the torpedo struck. When the torpedo exploded, he said, "I was blown right out of my shoes and into a life net a dozen feet away. I crawled back to my station, and since the electric power was off, I tried to work the gun manually, but she was jammed. Then came the order to abandon ship. I helped release a life raft on the starboard side and jumped into the water. The water was almost freezing, and the wind felt even colder. When I pulled myself aboard the raft, there were 18 or 19 of us. When we were finally picked up, there were only 3 or 4. A storm was blowing, and the waves started to break over the small raft. Gowers and Joseph Reynes, seaman first class, crawled around to the men sitting still, trying to keep them awake. But those that were freezing knew it. Gower said, "One boy said, 'I'm dying. I can't hold out any longer.' And in a minute he was gone. Finally, the Coast Guardsmen left on the raft saw the ship Joyce, which had dropped behind for rescue work. Joyce saw them but couldn't pick them up at that moment because the U-boat was firing torpedoes at her. The men on the raft watched in despair as the ship slowly pulled out of sight. And as I mentioned, Joyce finally came back and picked up the survivors, but that must have been a harrowing experience for all of the crew members of the USS Joyce. So that's the context for the presentation of this award. And And I understand I'm going to present this to you. Citation reads, "The United States of America, to all who shall see these presents greetings, know that this is to certify that the President of the United States of America has awarded the Purple Heart, established by General George Washington at Newburgh, New York, August 7, 1782, to Nelson Nersasian, Seaman First Class, United States Coast Guard, for wounds received in action on 9 March 1944. Given under my hand in the city of New York this 31st day of March 2011. Signed, Robert J. Pack, Commandant, United States Coast Guard." Here's the Purple Heart. Thank you. Let me turn it so everybody can see it. Here's what the Purple Heart citation looks like, and on the left side over here is one of the very few pictures of the Leopold. We did a search to find something with the Leopold in action, and we found a picture of her being launched in 1943, so that will accompany this. A proud ship and a dedicated crew, but just absolutely unfortunate circumstances, but they gave their lives for our country so that we can enjoy our freedoms today. And for that, we thank your brother Nelson. Okay. Robert, you want to say a few words?
Yeah, it's hard to know where to start. He's been our brother for a long time, and never once did he mention anything about the war. At least not to me, perhaps to Anne. I think he was just so guarded about the trauma that he had suffered that he just kept it to himself. Because of my daughter Tori and her interest, having just arbitrarily gone through the web and seeing that a Purple Heart was awarded last year to a Mr. Daube, D-A-U-B-E, who was a crew member, and the last survivor of the Leopold, she had wondered why the whole crew wasn't honored for that day in World War II. It was the first and I believe the only destroyer escort that the Coast Guard lost in World War II, and I'll stand corrected on that. She had done a paper in high school as a sophomore or junior, and perhaps my son or daughter could answer that better, and actually had an interview with him. There is a recording that I hope will get out there so people can listen to it. And the Admiral tried it in his computer, but you know, our knowledge of computers isn't good. It doesn't work on a computer, even though it's a computer-driven disc, but it does work on your CD player. Because I went frustratingly trying to get it to work on a computer. But he gives a detailed of that event on March 9, 1944, from sighting the sub. He did it in a manner that a 15 or 16-year-old child would not be scared to death, even though there was carnage everywhere. But as he described it, that sub was going left to right. He was on the 3-inch 50, the second deck gun, not the first gun, and he fired as the fire. He was the pointer on that cannon, and he swears to the day he died that they put 11 shots into that sub. Of course, the seas are 30 to 50 feet in height. It's freezing. It's in the middle of winter off of Iceland. Did they hit him? Didn't they hit him? Who knows? I mean, like he said, everything is bobbing up and down, and he said, out of nowhere, the ship was split in half. Because although official Coast Guard records that I have read said there was one sub, every crew member interviewed, and my brother on his tape swear there were 2 subs. They were caught in a wolf pack. There was one directly off the bow and one on the port beam. And, you know, as the Admiral had said, it was a new acoustic torpedo. It came out of nowhere. He describes inside the gun turret on this tape what had happened. One of the other fellows just was in shock. bleeding and unable to talk or move. Nobody had their life jackets on because things happened so fast. And there was a shell jammed inside the barrel of the gun, and they tried to fire it manually, but everybody was so confused that what they had done is put in a flare shell. And of course it went off, and all it did is lit up the sky, so the Germans had a better opportunity to shoot them. I mean, and it was, the description there is trying to get off the boat and into the water. I mean, they didn't even know if there was a life raft. Like he said, 3 to 4 feet was the difference between life and death, because the water was about 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The waves were just like a tsunami. And how anybody survived that day, I'll never know. But the tape is wonderfully presented. I hope the Coast Guard Museum will take it, because I don't know how many they've got like that down there. But he made it to a raft. He was hanging on the side. When the Joyce finally was able to come back, which took several hours because they were under fire, the survivors were not even able to climb up the netting. They were frozen solid. And there was one Italian guy, he said he was as big as a house, and he just lowered himself on a rope and just grabbed guy after guy after guy and shimmied up the rope and brought him onto the Joyce. I think one of the tragic things, as the descriptor said of one of the 2 life rafts that made it, is there were 40 or 50 men on the stern of the boat, because the boat had literally split in half with the bow and stern pointing up in the air, held together just by the deck. And they were all up there, and then one gigantic wave came, and the ship went under and came up, and there was nobody, including Ken Phillips, the captain of the ship, was with his crew there. So they finally get on the Joyce, and of course, being a Salem native, you know, he's on the deck, he's 23 years old, he's, I'm sure, delighted to still be alive. And somebody walks up to him and says, "Sparky, anything you want, what can I get you?" And, you know, the 6 degrees of separation, it's the doctor's son who delivered him, me, you, and our other 2 siblings, which was literally 2 houses away. They didn't even know they were both in the Coast Guard. They didn't know they were both in the same convoy. They didn't know they were both in destroyer escorts. And he gave them half a bottle of rye whiskey. And that is the end of the rescue, to my knowledge. So you'll enjoy hearing the tape. And then the follow-up back in Cleveland and in Ireland, which I'm not going to get into. There's too many Irishmen here. But you'll enjoy it.
It's a fascinating story. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
I'm reading a book from one of my officer candidate school classmates. My class had the sinking of the Coast Guard cutter Cuyahoga in Chesapeake Bay in 1978. And last night I just read the chapter where they had the collision in the bay and the survivor story. And decades later, crew members are still haunted by those that they couldn't get to. And it was a cold Chesapeake Bay, late fall evening, and of course it was pitch dark after the ship went down. And just the whole idea of trying to corral people for a rescue. I'm sure it was very much like the story for the Leopold. The Leopold was even in colder water. So I doubt if the crew members that weren't able to find something to hang on to had less than maybe 30 or 40 minutes to survive in that cold water. It's just extraordinary, and you know that unfortunately was a similar story that played out for my class in 1978. But that's what happens occasionally at sea, and you know, those that survive sometimes wonder how they made it, and somebody else didn't. And I will guess that's probably something that was always in your brother's mind as well, because 171 people didn't survive, and that's extraordinary. But you know, for all their sacrifice, this is very symbolic for the entire crew of the USS Leopold. And I was going to talk just a little bit about the, you know, how did we miss this for Purple Hearts? But there were over 950,000 casualties during World War II. Now, those aren't all deaths; those are injuries and deaths. You know, almost 1 million people from 1941 to 1946. I suspect there's still some out there that their families or they as individuals weren't given that distinctive medal for their service, and that's most unfortunate. But I thank your daughter for having the perseverance to chase this story down and to do this for your brother. I wish we could have done it 67 years ago. But the whole idea of Coast Guard crew members on a Navy ship working in a convoy at a very, very busy time, I think there are lots of those things that just get missed. So please thank her for her perseverance.
I will.
Okay.
And again, if I may add, I think it's been recommissioned.
Well, I'll have to check that
I have
out.
a paper I'm going to show you.
Okay.
We were invited to it. Whether or not it came to pass, I don't know. But it's a cutter.
Okay. It could very well be that that my information is dated. I'll have to find out if that's going to be the names of one of our new fast response cutters. I haven't seen the whole list of names. The very first one of those is being named after a Coast Guard hero from Cape Cod named Bernie Weber. And it's the first one commissioned, and the whole series of ships, we should get over 50 of them. I think 58 is the number. Will be named for Coast Guard heroes, and maybe that's the one you're referring to. So I'd love to see that article.
I'll show you the document.
Okay. So,
Thank you.
one thing before we go outside. I want to present a larger version of the launching of the USS Leopold to your family. This is the one photo that we have, and I saw that and I said, we've got to get that to you. So, a memento for your brother. So much.
Thank you. Sparky Nersasian Jr. was one of the nicest human beings you could ever want to meet. With his dad, he ran Nelson Spar Grocery here in Salem from probably the 30s right up to the early 70s. I first met him when I was about maybe 3 months old. He had just come back on leave from the sinking and was going down Highland Avenue to my father's store in the corner of Boston and Essex, at which time my dad was driving up in a 37 Oldsmobile. My brother, with a full beard on his face, jumped on the running boards, and my old man socked him because he didn't recognize him and said, "Where are you going?" And he said, "You've got a baby brother, we're going to the hospital, get in." That's the first time I met him. He was my best friend, my best man, my mentor, a brilliant guy. Absolutely brilliant. A member of Mensa, never went to college, didn't have to. He was self-educated, a lover of poetry and literature and music, and just the most humble person you ever want to meet. And a damn good softball pitcher, because Tully Square won the championship for years in the city of Salem. And in a nutshell, that's the man who long ago should have gotten his Purple Heart, but what goes around comes around. And here we are in 2011. It took 67 years and a 2-star admiral, but he finally got what he earned. And we are so proud of him. The whole family is. And we miss him.